Well, trying to cover 40 years in 30 minutes or less, I think it's quite a challenge. I'm very pleased to be here. I was one of the original founders of the Intertribal Timber Council. At one time, the Intertribal Timber Council was just sort of a twinkle in the eye. So I'm going to give you a little bit of history, some reflections of the past, the present, and what I see for the future. I entitled the presentation, Awesome at 40. And we'll see what happens from this point on. But a little bit about the past. I'm going to go back a few hundred years. But this was once Indian country, and that wasn't very long ago. And one of the things that was really interesting about how tribal peoples related to the land is something called Ethno Ecology. And it basically means that every culture adopted to the resources, the places, that were important to maintain their cultures and environments. A few hundred years ago, this was a land of plenty. And it wasn't just because of happenstance of nature. It was because the land and the environment had been shaped by tribal peoples. The forests, the prairies, the waters provided everything that was needed to sustain tribal cultures and economies. The medicines, the foods, buffalo, fish. But within a few years, something happened. And that was basically the imposition of European culture, European values, European science on the land. What happened within a few years? Well, the air and the waters were sick and getting sicker. We had certain species became endangered, so endangered that the United States enacted the Endangered Species Act in 1973. So the once blue marble that we've seen so many pictures of today became something new. We have a new blue planet, and it looks sort of like a trash bag that's exploding. When the Intertribal Timber Council was being formed, these were troubled times socially and politically. We were coming out of the Vietnam War. There were lots of protests going on. We had the occupation of the Bureau of Indian Affairs, Wounded Knee. We had violence occurring on the campuses, Kent State. We had Martin Luther King raise issues of social justice. And 40 years ago, tribal activism was also at the forefront. This was a time of controversy, and it was a time when tribal self-determination began to make itself known. So with tribal self-determination, this was pitting the way in which the federal government was treating tribes and managing their resources against the desire for greater tribal say and tribal self-determination. That led to the Indian Self-Determination Act being enacted in 1975. That act provided a means for tribes to develop and manage their own resources and their own programs, and it provided an opportunity for tribes to redirect management towards tribal goals and objectives. One of the speakers this morning mentioned President Nixon's speech in 1970 at Taos Pueblo, in which President Nixon enunciated a new vision for tribal federal relations, basically self-determination without termination. The first Assistant Secretary for Indian Affairs was Forrest Girard. And Forrest used to work for Senator Henry Jackson and was very instrumental in terms of the development of the Indian Self-Determination Act. At that time, problems in Indian forest management were quite apparent. The General Accounting Office and the American Indian Policy Review Commission had issued reports identifying serious problems and deficiencies. There were reports that were out saying the Bureau of Indian Affairs forestry program was seriously underfunded and understaffed. The BIA management was dominated by a focus on timber sales, and tribal goals and objectives for management of their resources were going unheard. And Indian forests and tribal communities were paying the price. It was also clear at that time that the health of natural resources and tribal communities were very closely intertwined. The tribal cultures and economies were still intimately tied to the land, and that healthy, productive natural resources provide opportunities for income, meaningful employment, and provide important sources of foods, medicine, water, fuel, shelter, and places for spiritual renewal. With passage of the Indian Self-Determination Act, a few tribal leaders recognized the need and the opportunity. The Intertribal Timber Council was very fortunate to have some strong leadership from the Pacific Northwest primarily. Ken Smith from the Warm Springs tribe was the first ITC president. He was also the second assistant secretary for Indian Affairs. Joe Dela Cruz, my longtime friend and a mentor at the Quinault Nation, was a founder of the Intertribal Timber Council. And George Beauchamp, the former chairman of the Makah tribe and the former ITC president, recognized that there was a need and an opportunity for tribes to gain a presence in forest management. So the few tribal leaders got together and recognized that we didn't want to be in a position where we're constantly saying we should have done this, or we would have done that, or we could have done that. So they decided to seize the day and recognize that together we can accomplish a lot, individually we couldn't. If not us, who? If not now, when? If not here, where? There were formidable rehabilitation problems that we were facing at that time. I was working at Quinault. We were basically looking at 60,000 acre clear cuts on the reservation. We had an average of 200 tons of slash left on the ground per acre that was preventing us from being able to rehabilitate the land. Tribal leadership at that time decided that it was time Indian country got together and started sharing some of their views and perspectives and some of the issues that they saw confronting Indian forestry. So a decision was made, we were going to convene a timber symposium. And the first Intertribal Timber Council symposium was convened in Seattle, Washington. We had roughly 3 weeks in which we started to put together the symposium until the time we convened it. This is a photo of the first symposium, which was entitled Making Dollars and Cents Out of Forestry. And at that meeting, we brought together representatives of private industry, academia, the Bureau of Indian Affairs, the Forest Service, and others to share how they were going about managing Indian forests. A small steering committee was formed to set up this symposium. There was Earl Wilcox, myself, Ken Smith, Joe Dela Cruz, and Vernon Clark of Colville. Earl Wilcox was the very first keynoter of the ITC, and Earl emphasized one of the major problems from his perspective, and that was the failure to produce the annual allowable cut that was required as a fiduciary obligation and responsibility of the United States for the management of Indian forests. Joe Dela Cruz shared some of his thoughts at that session as a visionary. This is what he saw as needing to be done. And Ken Smith became ITC's first president and the second assistant secretary for Indian Affairs. These visionaries recognized very early that we needed a unifying vision, because if we don't know where we're going, we'll never know when we get there. So what was ITC's vision when we first set it up? Well, the first one was that ITC was to be an organization comprised of tribal governments. And tribal governments come first, that there's an obligation for tribal governments to assume the responsibility to state the positions and the needs for their own communities on their own terms. But ITC could provide a service, and that was to provide information and to establish a process for tribes to be able to work together and develop a common agenda. We were going to rely upon tribal governments for support, not try to build an organization that was founded upon its own bureaucracy and own staff. We were going to collaborate, to work together, to address challenges, to build partnerships and trust in order to be able to move forward. We recognized at the time, despite the formidable challenges that we had in Indian forestry, that we had two challenges, two courses that we could take. One of them was just to fight, to file suit. Another one was to try to establish partnerships, to work together with the Bureau of Indian Affairs and others that recognized the need for reform. We chose the second path. We knew if we took the first path, what would happen was we would end up having a divided house. We were not going to be able to work together. We were going to create barriers instead of bridges. And if we even prevailed at the end, what good would it do? Because all we would be left with was perhaps a little bit of money, but the land was still going to be in need of restoration. So at the first symposium, the leadership and the membership with the tribal leaders that were intended there decided it was time to establish the Intertribal Timber Council. And we set up a mission to promote sound economic management, to provide information, to facilitate communication, to develop partnerships, support tribal-based, forest-based enterprises, and encourage training and development of Native American professions. And since that time, much has been accomplished. We've done a number of very significant things in terms of addressing issues for maintaining the ability to utilize administrative fees from timber sales and making those available for forest management. We enacted the National Indian Forest Resources Management Act and conducted 3 Indian Forest Management Assessment Teams. We've worked on secretarial orders, provide a number of presentations, and done special studies. This is a photo of Fred Matt, a former president of the ITC, accepting a conservation award from the Secretary Manuel on behalf of the Intertribal Timber Council. And since ITC's establishment, many youth have been inspired and inspired us in return. ITC has awarded over $800,000 in 426 scholarships over the years. We've developed memorandums of understandings with the universities and convened a number of information sharing sessions. And over the years, we've seen youngsters become leaders. We've recognized and honored outstanding contributions. These are the 1995 Earl Wilcox Award recipients. You may recognize some of them: Ken Smith, Larry Blythe, Mike Clemens, Jim Spitz, Gary Sims, and last year's Wilcox Award recipients. So far, the ITC has issued 21 national awards for outstanding individual achievement and 160 individual achievement awards and 4 special presidential awards, all recognizing contributions of individuals above and beyond. But during this time period, many more have lent a helping hand. So you see here in the upper left a picture of the 1985 board and the 1997 board. Don Peasley, a former president of the Intertribal Timber Council from Colville, and Earl Wilcox. But ITC's family has really grown over this time period. So we see Joanne and Don in the upper left, and a more recent picture on the right, Mark Phillips and Theron at our annual Christmas party, Jim Erickson, Truman Picard, and of course Laura. And the bottom line during this time period is that Indian forestry has been able to do more with less, both in terms of commodity production and ecological and environmental services, than any other federal and private entity. It's had less funding and greater diversity in Indian country, and what that's done has led to innovation and creativity. So ITC has been fortunate to have had a very solid foundation. It took hard work and dedication of others to build it into a strong national association to advocate for improved natural resource management, and the support of those individuals and their families has been critical to the ability of the ITC to build upon the foundation that was laid by leadership so many years ago. But the past is prologue, and the only time you should look behind is to see where you've been, how far you've come. But it's important that we recognize and understand that we can't afford to forget what we've learned along the journey. So where are we today? Are we out of the woods yet? Well, not yet. We've had 3 independent IFMAT reports, and those reports have illustrated a number of continuing problems. We've seen interdecadal changes in 8 mandated study areas under the FIRMA requirements. We've seen that Indian forests remain critically important to tribal communities, and we've seen that Indian forests are models for sustainability for all of American society. Yet progress in correcting deficiencies has been frustrating. Annual funding per acre is clearly inadequate and declining. Our federal funding for Indian forestry has declined by 23% since 1991 and is 33% of the Forest Service per acre funding. Fire preparedness for funding is only 25%. Hazardous fuel funding, 46%, and roads funding, 23%. So these are serious challenges. Other problems is that the very first problem that Earl Wilcox emphasized in his keynote speech was that we were still failing to produce our annual allowable cut. So this was recognized in 1977. In 1989, there was a special Senate Committee on Investigations where the VIA acknowledged that tribes had lost more than $330 million in the previous decade from poor management of their forests and woodlands. And since 1991, the Intertribal Timber Council has estimated that the failure to harvest the full allowable cut has cost Indian country over $700 million in stumpage and over 250,000 jobs. So the failure to care for the land in our forests is not just about money and jobs, but tribal communities are being affected in many ways. So what's the future look like? Some things will look very familiar, but other things will look very different from the past. Here's a glimpse of what I see from where I sit. Problems persist. We see continuing chronic underfunding and understaffing. Our ability to secure needed resources has been and continues to be compromised. It's compromised by the inability or unwillingness to fill position vacancies within the Bureau of Indian Affairs. We're not spending all the money that is being appropriated, so funds are being returned or being carried over for other purposes. And that makes it much more difficult for us to make up the funding shortfalls that IFMAT has identified over the years. So the question that I'm asking is this really a new form of surreptitious coercion? A new way for the United States to get out of the Indian business? We see more and more pressures for the federal government to press the responsibility for forest management onto tribes through self-determination contracts or self-governance compacts. And we know that the failure to provide adequate investment has very serious consequences. And Indian forestry today is at a tipping point. Chronic underfunding and staffing shortfalls are jeopardizing the future of Indian forests and communities. We're seeing increasing threats of catastrophic loss from wildfire, insects, disease, drought, and climate change, and they've got to be addressed proactively. We see economic and employment benefits being lost and opportunities not being pursued. And these will affect generations for tomorrow. American Indians and Alaska Native children suffer violence at rates higher than any other race in the United States. We see altered neurological development, poor physical and mental health, poor school performance, substance abuse, overrepresentation in the juvenile justice system, pervasive despair, hopelessness, and persistent poverty. Here are just a few statistics. This is, again, the funding decline. And it seems that trouble is everywhere. That politics is the art of looking for trouble, finding it everywhere, diagnosing it incorrectly, and applying the wrong solutions. We see our forests deteriorating health and productivity, hazardous fuel reductions, acres being treated being reduced, forest planting and thinning backlogs and Indian reservations, not really much progress there. We've got over 1 million acres of Indian forests across the country in need of treatment. We see threats to Indian forests, trespass, fragmentation of the landscape, invasive species, diseases like whitebark blister pine, and climate change. Wildfires, we see 3,800 wildfires burned 630,000 acres on Indian reservations from 2005 to 2014. And what's expected in the future is that our challenges are to become even greater. We've heard a lot about water at this session. Climate change, water, and forests are critical for us to keep in mind. We know our forests are facing drought, storms, flooding, sea level rise, snowpack, temperature, ecological impairment, fish and wildlife habitat is being affected. Our water supplies are also being affected. And at the same time, we recognize that healthy forests, if we care for our forests, they can protect water quality and quantity. Our forests currently provide over 60% of the fresh water that's consumed in the United States. They regulate temperature and sustain ecological processes, and they catch, store, and filter precipitation before it reaches streams and aquifers. This is a picture of what's been happening to the harvest level. We've seen the lowest harvest level in 80 years and 50 years of declining pattern. And the cumulative losses, again, are $700 million in stumpage and 250,000 jobs since 1991. And these are sorely needed employment opportunities. In 2013, President Obama spoke to tribal nations about pathways to get tribal people back to work. He says he's fighting for a responsible budget to invest in things that we need to do in order to make opportunities like education, job training, and community building a reality. And Indian country still faces staggering levels of unemployment. We know that adequately funded Indian forests will help build sustainable tribal communities and economies. But we also know that the whole future of the way in which our forests are managed and the things that we look for in the future from our forests is going to change substantially in the future. So in the future, we're not just looking at lumber. We're looking at fiber, biofuels. We're looking at cellulose, hemicellulose, lignin, bark and branches, bioenergy, and biomass. We're looking at potentials for increased opportunities for individual businesses and utilization of non-timber forest products. This is an area that the Intertribal Timber Council looked at a few years ago in its branding and marketing study, showing that there were very substantial opportunities for the generation of income from non-timber resources that we should begin to look at. Biorefining, I mentioned earlier, in terms of different things that can be done with the forest, looking at wood as a chemical property. And we're seeing new technologies being developed. Single cellulose nanocrystals. And carbon nanocrystals can be developed from forest biomass. They can also be developed by capturing carbon directly from the atmosphere. And these materials have tremendous versatility. They can produce a lot of materials for manufacturing and medicines. Ecosystem services, we've heard a little bit about today. Natural resources, the benefits, and the drivers of change. All of these factors are interrelated. We have a circle of life. That circle of life has many sectors and components. Climate, drought, heat, and insects are wreaking havoc with our nation's forests. But remember, biologically, the trees are water pumps, and the water deficits can stress forests and lead to outbreaks of insect disease and wildfire. But we also know that active forest management, forest treatments can greatly affect transpiration, water supplies, and stream flow. So water, drought, fire, and forests are important. and it's going to become increasingly important in the future. So how much do you know about forests and water? We know that managing forests for water and for climate cooling is possible. One of the challenges we're going to be facing in the future is building bridges. Management of our forests has become very fragmented, politically as well as economically. And our ability to be able to address many of the problems that we're facing in management of forests could very well turn upon our ability to look at water. Because as people become increasingly detached from the land, water may be key to connecting urban communities with the need to improve forest management. 66% of the nation's water supply comes from forests, 34% from elsewhere. So looking at water, and maybe not the trees themselves, may be key to our success in implementing landscape scale, cross-border kinds of management. So, can tribal management be sustained? Well, there are certainly major challenges out there. We've made a lot of progress, but don't lose heart. We have to press forward because we can't afford not to. When you feel like quitting, think about why you started. Think about that vision that the tribal leadership had in forming the Tribal Timber Council. If not us, who? If not now, when? If not here, where? And never give up. So what will tomorrow bring? First, we've heard a few words about the trust responsibility. The National Indian Forest Resources Management Act recognizes that the United States has a fiduciary trust responsibility for sustained management of Indian forests. And it also expressed concerns with governmental ability to fulfill its obligations. 2 decades later, the last IFMAT report, the independent team of experts recognized that the federal government continues to inadequately fulfill its trust obligations for Indian forestry. So it's time to change the game. We need to refocus the debate to strengthening trust relationships between the United States and tribal governments, to exercise greater tribal authority, tribal management direction and control of the resources, and to have the U.S. serve as an ally to support tribal sovereignty and reserved rights, to jealously protect the trust corpus and prevent encroachment and diminishment of trust resources. So the trust responsibility, we have been asking, how can we get the United States to fulfill its obligations? Maybe we should be asking a different question. Maybe a different question is, are they being forced? How much trust responsibility can we continue to move forward? Let's look at trust responsibility. It's time to turn it on its head. The trust responsibility should not be based upon trusting the United States to take care of Indians, to do what's best for Indians, but rather turn it around. It should be the responsibility of the United States to act in a manner that's worthy of our trust. So tomorrow's big challenge. We can't afford to play a victim card, get out of responsibility free. Responsibility and increased roles of tribal communities in those is going to be crucial. We're going to have to look inward and name ourselves. Hello, I'm accountable. Forest lands remain among Indian country's most valuable assets, but our forests are in trouble. And America's first stewards will be key to caring for our nation's forests and sustaining the benefits we desire through active management. And that's because of 5 major factors. First, tribal communities have a permanence of place. That permanence of place gives them certain knowledge, it gives them an understanding of the politics of particular situations. It gives them a basis to act in a responsible way. And tribal communities, because of their long history of stewardship, have a vision and a moral responsibility that spans generations. Tribal communities have thousands of years of experience and adaptability, adapting to change. Proven time and again, the ability to creatively and innovatively find solutions to problems. And tribes, lastly, have very unique political relationships and legal rights that they can bring to bear to improve the management of our nation's forests. So, the challenge of the future is to transform it. The third FMAT report used a unifying theme called FIT, for fire, investment, and transformation. Fire means we've got lots of threats to forest health. Investment is that we've got to make investments and come up with a proactive way of addressing deficiencies. And transformation, to change the tribal role in natural resource management from one of domination to partnership to leadership. Indian forests, we've got 334 forested reservations in 36 states. A little over 18 million acres held in trust. That's a third of the all Indian lands that are held in trust by the United States. But we know that tribal presence needs to be restored on the land. That tribal worldviews and wisdom are vital to the future of humanity and the resources upon which it depends. But this won't happen unless tribes are able to substantively influence the formulation and implementation of policies, programs, and actions that affect our natural resources. ITC is gaining increasing prominence as a national leader for progressive forest management to achieve the triple bottom line: economy, ecology, and community. And it is a big deal. Intertribal Timber Council, Phil Rigdon, and Nolan Colgrove are gaining increasing attention as leaders in improved management. We know that we can't do it alone, and on a fractured landscape, the spatial and temporal scope of actions needed to sustain the viability of our communities, the ecology, and the economic functions is going to depend upon our ability to develop partnerships. And that means that communication is key to inform and educate ourselves and others, to develop those partnerships and networks to work across landscape boundaries, to remain to keep things functional over time and to work together. Now, the first blue marble that I showed today showed that as Indian country. What's happened over time is that Indian country has been reduced to small islands of Indianness, and only islands remain. The ecological and economic functions that are essential to maintain tribal cultures and communities on the landscape no longer remains intact. When I look at that map, I don't see just little islands of Indians. I look at unrealized opportunities as well. That tribes could wield considerable political influence if they can speak with a unified voice. 334 reservations and 36 states. The tribal influence will be government to government and local economic power, not at the ballot box. American Indians and Alaska Natives comprise a small fraction of the total voters, and we know that an increasing portion of those tribal members are beginning to live in urban areas outside of tribal communities. So those of us in this room who have already committed our lives and our resources and careers to improvement of natural resources and improvement of Indian natural resources. So are we ready as an organization and as individuals to be leaders to face the challenges ahead? Do not go where the path may lead. Instead, go where there is no path and leave a trail. And that was what Ralph Waldo Emerson said. And are we ready to make it so? Are we ready to make today different from yesterday? Are we ready to make tomorrow different forever? With nothing but vision and will. 40 years ago, a few visionaries set out to make a difference. Those who followed built the ITC into what it has become today. What happens next is up to us. Thank you.
All right, we're coming down to our host presentation. Myself and Dwayne Chapman, our fire management officer, is going to be tackling the host presentation. Waiting for my presentation to come up.
So I should stop recording.